What I'd said to my parents and what I'd said to anyone else who had asked was that I, inshallah, went there with an intention to be able to help, and if it was my time and what was written for me for something to happen while I was there, then that's what I accepted. 902 families have been completely wiped out on the register. No one from those families lives on to carry that generation, that bloodline.
Knowing that you've been to Al-Aqsa courtyard, and now that we've received news that it has been bombed, how does that put things into perspective for you? How does that change things for you a little bit?
I feel like I'm going to wake up one day and the people in that hospital will tell me. People that I know have died because it's been bombed.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Dr. Bushra.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
It is an honor for us to have you joining us here today in the studio to tell us a little bit about your medical mission, your recent medical mission to Gaza.
Thank you very much for having me. I think the honor's all mine.
A lot of people say that to simply donate to the cause of Gaza and to keep the people of Gaza in our prayers is enough. But you took that extra step, that courageous step to go to Gaza, to go to Palestine. What was it that motivated you to take that step?
I think first and foremost, as a doctor, you take a Hippocratic oath knowing that you'll be able to train and then potentially serve your community, serve your people. And so it's instilled in us throughout our training to be able to serve others and provide help and aid. As a surgeon in particular, I always knew that at some point I'd like to go back to Palestine and be able to try to help my Palestinian community. I think over the last 12 months, what I was witnessing through my phone, the attacks on hospitals, the types of injuries that were occurring, the complete destruction of the healthcare system, I just felt completely helpless being all the way over here and recognising that there was potentially an opportunity for me to actually put into action what I'd always wanted, which was to be there on the ground, physically able to help. And I think not even just as a surgeon or as a Palestinian, but as a human, that feeling of helplessness and wanting to really put your money where your mouth is, as they say, to try to go over there and be a part of something where you might be able to make a difference in terms of not only just saving lives, but potentially bearing witness to the injustices that were occurring. I felt it was both a duty and an obligation to be able to try to make that happen. There are lots of people around the world, lots of doctors and nurses who would love to go and volunteer in Gaza and to be able to try to get there on the ground. And unfortunately, Israel's preventing many of us from trying to be able to go there now.
Could you describe what Gaza looked like to you?
No words will ever do it justice. And even till now, it's been 3 months almost since I've left. And whenever you see footage, you still can't believe that that is what Gaza looks like now. When we first entered through the UN convoy, you go down one of the two main roads, Salah ad-Din Road, and your eyes are bearing witness, but your mind just cannot comprehend the scale of destruction. So kilometres of buildings that have been blown to smithereens, metres high of rubbish and rubble, people walking barefoot in the street, bags of flour and rice that have been thrown about everywhere. And then the last hour or so, the cars or the UN convoy is weaving through all the tents of the displaced people everywhere. And again, it felt indescribable. So they say, picture paints 1,000 words. It's actually so much more confronting and horrific when you see it there in person. But I don't think I'll ever be able to truly give it justice to describe what Israel has done to Gaza.
This might be a tough question, but could you recall what was your hardest day in Gaza like?
Probably the last 24 to 36 hours. I think it's clear from everyone who has been to Gaza and has had to leave that they wish that they could have had an opportunity to stay. at least if not longer, then for a much, much longer period, or never having left at all. And so I understood at a theoretical level that at some point the mission was going to come to an end, and that we would have to leave. There was some discussions about when that was going to be, and the thought from the team was that we still had a few days before we were meant to exit Gaza. On that very last day, there had been a bombing nearby to Al-Aqsa hospital, which is where we were based in Deir al-Balah. And so a number of women and kids were brought in with devastating injuries, one of them being a young boy with his abdomen completely ripped open, his guts spilling out, and bleeding to death from injuries to some of his major vessels. And juxtaposing that with a young male who'd been sniper shot in the pelvis and the lower limb, who again was also brought into the hospital and was bleeding out. So you can imagine the emotions of seeing a young child with their guts spilling out everywhere, knowing that you probably won't be able to do anything really to save them in that current circumstance. So my colleague, Dr. Jamal, and some of the local staff were working on that young boy, while I helped some of the other local staff work on the young male that had been brought in with the gunshot injury. And we were operating late into the evening, and the medical team got word at about 9 p.m. in the evening that our team was going to have to exit the next day. I was still operating when I got that news, and I think I was in denial and in shock. I'd made plans with some of the nurses that were coming to work for the next shift at 8 a.m. the next morning to give them some presents and to say goodbye to them. I hadn't yet had a chance to maybe say my goodbyes to the rest of the teams. And so once we finished operating at about 11, I was going round to my patients to bid them farewell, to check on them one last time. And so I think probably those goodbyes were the hardest, knowing that Israel was going to make it impossible to get back there.
Yeah. It's a really tough experience. I can see that this experience meant a lot to you.
Yeah.
It really impacted your life, I think. How has this experience impacted the way that you're going to lead the rest of your life?
I think, subhanAllah, everyone has certain moments or certain experiences that are probably more transformative than others. And I think this particular mission and my time in Gaza was that transformative experience for me. I think one thing in particular is trying to reconcile not only your duty as a human to what's occurring over there, but your obligation as a Muslim, as a Palestinian, as a doctor who has certain principles, ethical principles and moral obligations that we're meant to uphold. But also then reconciling that Allah's given us such privilege and generosity here in our lives in Australia, and that our brothers and sisters are suffering beyond comprehension over there, so that really every day you have to do everything in your capacity to be able to advocate for them, to try to get this assault, this genocide to stop in whatever way you can.
Despite all of the destruction and suffering that the people of Gaza are experiencing, we still see the hope that comes in from them, the resilience that they have. What did you observe about their resilience whilst you were there?
I think Palestinians in general, have been forced to be resilient. This is a people that have been under occupation for over 76 years. They've had to live with having limited power and electricity, limited supplies, limited access to food and water. When they protest peacefully, they get shot at, their homes get demolished. Any hopes and dreams that they have for their children in terms of education or schooling or travel is consistently shattered and destroyed. And yet they are a people who show love, such generosity, not only with their time, but with their money, their food, their ability to care for you and spend time with you. There were so many moments of glimmer and joy scattered throughout our time in Gaza. And they've had to learn to just make the best of the situation that Allah has placed them in. And their ability to do that really comes down to their strong faith and tawakkul in Allah, that this is what He has ordained for them to go through. And no matter what that entails, they will say, Alhamdulillah, they will say thanks for that. So the little kids in the courtyard, always wanted to come and play with us. They were always smiling. They'd want to sing us an nasheed or recite us Qur'an, mashallah. There's so many people in Gaza have memorized so much of the Qur'an. Even in theatre or throughout the hospital, people would still joke around and reminisce with you and be able to sort of tell you about their lives and take pride in that. And that's one thing that will never be conquered. Not only their resilience, but that ability to love, to have community, to be joyful despite all of the extenuating circumstances.
Could you tell me a little bit about the challenges that you faced within the hospital system, within the healthcare system? How did the hospital work? How did that change between your own perception, your own practice here in Australia?
We come from a place where there is no such thing as scarcity, really, here in a lot of Western medicine. Anything that you want, whether that be a stapler device, a suture, any dressings for patients, there's not really a circumstance or a time that I can think of where I haven't had access to almost anything that I would have needed. And Gaza operates on the complete opposite side of the spectrum to that. And you really have to think a little bit outside of the box as to how to be able to provide any sort of reasonable care for patients. Some of the most shocking things have been just the healthcare facilities themselves. So, Israel has targeted hospitals, they've bombed certain buildings, yep. They've prevented medical aid and supplies from entering. So all of the medical mission teams that have been entering ever since the military's burnt down the Rafah border crossing with Egypt have meant that you can't bring in medications, you can't bring in medical aid or supplies. You travel between Israel and into Gaza and you see all of those supplies just sitting there, not being allowed in. And when you're physically there on the ground in the hospital, there'll be a mass casualty in the emergency department. It'll be completely chaotic. There's no disposable gloves for you to find. There's one blood pressure machine for the whole emergency department. Patients are on the floor because there's no beds and there's no space for them to be treated. People will die because you just simply don't have any of the basic requirements to be able to treat them. So whether that be medications, fluids, blood products, the ability to do certain scans. When we were there, the X-ray machine that some of the orthopedic surgeons use, the bone surgeons, broke down, and maybe 70 to 80 patients were unable to get their emergency operations with their broken bones because of that machine being broken. Now, the parts can't come in from outside Gaza because Israel won't allow them to. And so the local engineers, and one of the engineers on our medical mission team, Khalid Shakhshir, was able to get that machine up and running when he came and joined us in Gaza. And the celebration in that hospital was bigger than the celebration for Eid. So the ability for the local staff to treat patients and have a machine that was allowing them to do their jobs was, indescribable scenes of joy. And even till now, I'm getting updates all the time from the ground. There's no sterile gowns, there's no sterile gloves, there's no gauze, there's no dressings for patients, there's no catheter bags, there's no stoma bags. There's just literally nothing. And there are no supplies almost within Gaza for them to be able to access it. So when we were there, we ran out of sterile gowns. You can imagine how the wound infection rates would be sky high because of that inability to maintain any form of sterile conditions. And there was no cloth in Gaza for us to be able to even source to try to clean and use in the operating theatres. And what ended up happening was they got the overalls from the kitchen that were being used and they cut some of that cloth up and they tried to sterilise that as a form of protection. But even now, they don't even have the ability to do that. The power and water would cut out constantly, so we'd definitely be operating under phone lights. If the water cut out, sometimes the operating theatre would just stop unless it was literal life or limb. And even then, what can you do in a situation where you don't even have the basic supplies to be able to treat your patients? So I think the disparity of feeling like you have the skills and the skill set, and not only me, I mean, all of the local staff that work there have excellent skills to be able to care for their patients, but the conditions prevent them from doing so, and you'll see patients die because of that.
How did you see the Palestinian people dealing with loss, and how did you and the rest of your medical mission also deal with loss on that experience?
I think there are a number of different ways that we saw loss manifest. So many people who might watch Al Jazeera News would recognise that in one area of the Al-Aqsa hospital is where all the janazah prayers happen, where the bodies come to be cleaned and then enshrouded in the white cloth. And that occurs constantly, day in, day out. So whenever you'd walk around the hospital, you'd always see families crying for their loved ones that have been killed and murdered, and janazah prayers occurring. And, you know, some of those cloths look like they're covering small bodies. There's so many children that have been caught in this assault. And it's exceptionally difficult. It's a heavy, heavy burden on your heart to see children in particular. You see 18-month-old babies that have lost both their parents in bombings to their homes, that have come in with severe burns. You know, there's a term that's been coined during the last 12 months, wounded child, no surviving family. And I remember I spoke about that in November of last year. I said, how is it that we can have thousands of kids with no surviving family members? That's atrocious. I think the other thing to say is that we were only there for a short period, for the 3 weeks. How can you imagine, in the wider community, I'm not even talking about healthcare workers here, but any Palestinian in Gaza, seeing that death every single day, seeing their own family members being slaughtered. And for some, that's a relief. You know, they've, inshallah, got a one-way ticket to Jannah, and they've been relieved from their suffering. But your heart can't help but suffer under that psychological assault of what's happening to your people.
Would you be able to show us and walk us through some of the photos that you took during your trip?
Yeah.
This is a janazah prayer.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
7 or 8.
Yeah, 7 or 8. And I'm assuming this was a constant process of janazahs that's happening at the hospital.
Yeah. So that room back there is where they will put the bodies in the fridge, waiting for either family members to come and say goodbye. And the room on that back corner is where they will
wash and clean
the bodies. Yeah.
Families of Gaza are really breaking down because of it. Generation after generation.
902 families have been completely wiped out on the register. No one from those families lives on to carry that generation, that bloodline.
Did you ever fear for your own life while you were there?
Strangely, no. And even I think when I sort of volunteered my name and hoped that I would have the ability to be able to go to Gaza, I'm not sure if partly it was denial or being naive. I recognised what it meant to be there. I mean, there is no safe place anywhere. Schools are not a safe place. Shelters are not a safe place. Hospitals are not meant to be a target, they're meant to be a safe haven. And just this morning, the Aqsa hospital has had rockets attack tents housing displaced people in its courtyard. So at a very basic level, I think everyone who enters knows that anything is possible while you're there. It does not matter that you're an international volunteer. You're not necessarily recognised as having any other value compared to anyone else there. And I suppose what I'd said to my parents and what I'd said to anyone else who had asked was that I, inshallah, went there with an intention to be able to help. And if it was my time and what was written for me for something to happen while I was there, then that's what I accepted. And when you're there, you know, the people around you of Gaza, they don't sort of think of it in that way that at any moment they could potentially get caught up in something or, you know, might die. They recognise that there's no safe place, but they still carry on with their life. And so I suppose when we were there, that permeated into how we acted and how we thought as well. But I recognise that it's the reality that certain people who might enter might never make it out.
Yeah. You worked along Palestinian doctors and nurses. What are some of the qualities that you saw in them that you see yourself carrying on into your future practice?
I think one of the biggest things is compassion and empathy. These doctors and nurses are beyond burnt out. Yeah. They've been stuck and besieged in hospitals, surrounded by army tanks. You know, some of them worked at Al-Shifa and were stuck there for 37 days, never being able to leave that hospital. And yet they worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, doing the best that they could to try to save any life when they were there. And their compassion for their colleagues, their compassion for the patients that they treat, you know, willing to listen to their stories, willing to go above and beyond trying to provide some sort of basic healthcare for them. I think that'll definitely stick with me. I do feel like my heart somehow has expanded by being there. And I think the love that they show to each other and also to us, the generosity with which they treated us and cared for us, again, is something else that I didn't necessarily expect, because these people don't have anything. They don't have money. They don't have the ability to access meat, fruit and vegetables, eggs. They haven't had any of these things for months. And when they got the opportunity to access them, what they would want to do was to show you respect and honour you by giving you those things. So they would give beyond their own means so much. And just their ability to endure, you know, that strength, that faith that they have in Allah and their reliance on the deen to really pull them through, that's something else that's really stuck with me.
What sort of message would you have to get medical aid, to get food, to get all of these things that the people of Gaza desperately, desperately need? What sort of message would you give?
I think the people are doing what they can, but it's governments around the world, as well as health organisations and the NGOs that have been in Gaza for long before 12 months, that know the situation on the ground. So the wider community definitely needs to be engaged and to raise their voice, but we need to be putting political pressure on our MPs and our governments to intervene. We need to be calling to allow medical aid and supplies to enter without restriction. Yeah. So there is no reason, there is no logical, common sense reason that medical aid and supplies should be prevented from entering Gaza. And why our governments are not ensuring that Israel complies with international humanitarian law to allow that to occur is baffling. Yep. That's unacceptable. I think I've spoken a little bit about healthcare facilities and healthcare workers. It's not enough to just make statements to say that these places are meant to be protected under international humanitarian law, but once that's broken, there needs to be consequences to say that we won't stand for that. So medical organisations, governments, and the wider community needs to be able to put pressure onto Israel to say that this can't go on. It's been happening for 12 months. You know, Al-Ahli hospital was bombed, Al-Shifa hospital was besieged. There are no fully functioning hospitals in Gaza at the moment. And what's currently been occurring in the last 7 to 8 days in the north of Gaza, where 3 hospitals have been told to evacuate by the army, including newborn babies on ventilators in a machine in an area that has no ability for paramedics to transfer these patients anywhere else, that's committing them to a death sentence. And that's a grotesque moral stain on humanity, that we can allow that to occur.
If you had the opportunity to go back to Gaza, would you?
I wouldn't have left if it was up to me. I'm a Palestinian, so I've got Palestinian blood. And for the last 2 to 3 months, Israel has said to the WHO that anyone with Palestinian blood will not be allowed to get back in. So many healthcare workers from around the world have tried to apply and they've been rejected. And so now I won't have that opportunity again. How governments and national medical organisations can stand for the fact that there can be discrimination based on race about who wants to volunteer on a medical mission to get into Gaza is unacceptable.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's just some ongoing heartbreak that I may not necessarily get that opportunity to go back. There's plenty of work to be done here, not only in Australia, but in the wider Western community. But of course, if I could get that opportunity to go and see what have become my family and friends, I would love to.
You've been continuously telling your story about your experience.
Yeah.
Why is that so important for you?
It's that same basis of why I felt it was necessary to try to go. It's a duty and an obligation. But more than that, I think we need to humanise the Palestinians, and me being able to share their stories once I've been given that platform of having returned is crucial. I need to know that they're reassured that their connection to me will hopefully be of use to garnering support for them. But I think the bigger impact is actually just, one, strengthening the resolve of anyone who might hear their stories or hear about what's going on over there. So despite what you and I might think that everyone's aware of what's going on the ground, that's not necessarily the case. And so continuously speaking up and advocating and educating people about what's going on there is important to reach an audience that might not necessarily hear about it. But I think it also serves as a bit of inspiration and motivation for people who might be burnt out from having spoken about Palestine for longer than the 12 months. I mean, we've been trying to advocate for basic human rights for Palestinians for almost 80 years, and people are tired. And I think sometimes just maybe hearing it from someone who's been there on the ground, especially more recently, hopefully will light a bit of a flame and encourage them to continue speaking up, or potentially encourage others who might not have said anything before to come forward and start to speak up.
Knowing that you've been to Al-Aqsa courtyard, and now that we've received news that it has been bombed, how does that put things into perspective for you? How does that change things for you a little bit?
I cannot believe it. I received video footage of tents burning, people inside being burnt to death. Yeah. And the fact that this beautiful, what should be a safe place, it's not. I feel like I'm going to wake up one day and the people in that hospital will tell me, people that I know have died because it's been bombed.
It's hard to imagine when you haven't been there, but when you have been there, it's a whole nother story.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That was home for 3 weeks, and I still think of the fact that I left my heart there.